You're all Thanks everyone for being here. I'm sure you're all as excited as Rona and I are to hear about this new collection of prose from Ted Berrigan, edited by Alice Notley, Anselm Berrigan, Edmund Berrigan, and Nick Sturm. This collects around 22 years of prose, so far uncollected, and offers it to a very excited reading public of, I think, fans and scholars alike. So we're going to start today off by hearing some remarks about the collection from Alice. Alice, would you mind taking it away?
Okay, this is my first appearance in one of these events. So I wrote prepared remarks, which won't take very many minutes, about 4, I think. Prepared remarks. A couple things I see and get the money. Ted made everything he did be a work of art. Everything he wrote down for any reason. He never just scrawled. His prose exhibits this propensity of his. It was as much a part of him as his humor was. I'm not like that except unconsciously, so I'm in awe of it. Ted was deliberate. The strangeness and devotion of something like the Basho Journal's manuscripts, which I sold at the Phoenix bookstore, but he made the package, consisting of the Penguin translation by someone, Nobuyuki Yuasa, that he changed, assisted into terrific English, that copy of the book with his black ink corrections, along with a manuscript, with a typescript or typescripts perhaps, decorated. Nick will know. Ted kept making booklets out of the typescripts or their copies. I have one with Victorian flower stickers on it. He would lovingly put such materials together, and I would go to the Phoenix and chat up Bob Wilson, always a pleasure, and get the money. I see this care, this saving of things, all the folders, and the folders remade into further folders by me in the book we have just edited and published. And I see, for example, the implication that a whole poem by a poet being reviewed was by itself almost a review, like when you read a poem you like aloud to a friend, or that a rearrangement of lines from the book by the poet reviewed was a review. In fact, a way of having a dialogue in the language of poetry, which is the most relevant one. Finally, isn't it? You could say what's really being said by highlighting lines, and you could talk to lines with other lines. The criticism is already in the poetry. Or I recall rescuing brain damage from the trash. It is outrageous and offensive and out to lunch, but I rescued it. Or I remember when he cut up 10 things about the trip to Boston into strips, having found an old typescript of it, an original archival sheet typed way before the book Back to Boston, with contributions also by Ron Padgett and Tom Clark, was published by Telegraph Books. He was sort of falling asleep, but asked me to find an envelope to put them in, and I counted them and said, there are only 9. Then he dictated to me the missing thing, the final one, and I wrote it on the outside of the envelope, a new item of potential exhibit for the folder, longer works of the more academic type. This was fun. Or the outrageousness of everything we did in the 70s so that I can barely read those journals. Note, just reread them, they're fabulous. My embarrassment at the arrival report being its subject. So I didn't see the place at the very end in this edition where Gisela's name didn't get properly spelled out. Pardon me, Gisela Brotherston, friend in Wivenhoe. Get the Money is a book about life and art being coincident all the time. Ted was always making art, like Joe and Andy, Joe Brainerd, Andy Warhol, and he was very funny. Longer works of the more academic type was something he wrote on a folder in which he kept some of the works presented in what is now Get the Money. When the folder fell apart about 10 years ago, I had carted everything he'd written across the ocean a long time before. I just rewrote the title on a new folder. Over the years, everything in it, all the originals, have become art. They look old and yellow, and some of them are from newspapers, originals of flyers pages of the Poetry Project newsletter cut out and made into booklets with magic markers and glitter. This is what an archive is, like ancient art is, things becoming more beautiful and interesting through time. The work in itself is that too. This is probably the only thing time is good for. I now, in fact, like brain damage. Before, I only rescued it. I love everything he wrote for the Poetry Project newsletter. Before, it was what was going on. But it's art, obviously. Tributes to people and things no one knows about now because of the weirdness of mainstream decisions as to what is great. Those tributes are very poignant. I would like for George and Joe to be around for this. There is an entire incomprehensible letter, probably to Bernadette, never typed or sent, on the other side of something, maybe two somethings, in the original manuscript of longer works of the more academic type. Just to say, Lita Hornick, the Beaks, the New York Jets. The prose is measured, almost metered in different ways. It's often like poetry, or like talking, or like Boswell's Johnson, or like being with Ted. The secret is presence, or presence is the secret to everything. Offside, he continues to help Anselm do his math homework by taking the telephone apart. He essentially does Eddie's homework for him under the guise of showing him how to write neatly between margins. He is amusing himself. He is caring about every single thing. As he finds new friends even now, Nick Sturm, for example, Yasmin, Rona, and Garrett, of course. We respond back with love. P.S. Ron has sent us some further information about brain damage that Larry Fagan called a 1970 Mimeo book, Brain Damage, in homage, that a small magazine that ran for 2 issues was called Brain Damage, and that Ron's old Columbia roommate, Eddie came while his dad worked for the AMA Journal, portions of which Ted cut up into Brain Damage. Somewhere in all of this information, Alice Neal and Jane Freilicher and Red Grooms sit serenely, having been reviewed in Art News. Jim Brody, Harry Fainlight, Anselm Hollow, Joe Chiravalo, blurbed, introduced at readings, obited. Where was the review of Joel Oppenheimer published? How old was Jim Carroll really at any time? Ask Steve Facey, Steve Carey, Ed Sanders, Lorenzo Thomas. Can Anne Waldman's character really be explained by the great Constella's Aries horoscope? Who's buried behind Lufkin's diner, for Christ's sakes? Maybe Frank knows by now. Too many names? Too many? Didn't you ever know anyone in your life? P.P.S. I've been rereading the book for the last 2 days, and it's so good, so alive, so inspiring. It isn't ancient art. I repeat, it's utterly alive. So that's what I have to say.
I have the impossible task of talking after that and everything else that's about to follow. I think we all start off as fangirls in a way, and you just really fueled that fire with your poem disguised as remarks. So thank you very much for that. Nick, I think you're going to share a little bit with us about how the book has come together and some of the editorial process.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I should say like how I came into this project a little bit, and that we've been trying to decide what year all of this started, and it's something. Yeah, it's something like sometimes it's 2017 and sometimes it's like 2014. But as Alice is suggesting, I came to Ted's Prose partly in the archive and the Basho translation booklet that she was describing selling to Bob Wilson. I believe that same copy is at Emory's archive.
Right.
And so I was encountering that loving, amusing care in these material objects and wondering about their lives as works, and starting to recognize over time that there were so many of these kinds of works floating around, whether they were in an archive or whether they were these individual initialed reviews in art news that just have the small TB initials at the bottom. And I think that my devotion to participating in this kind of editorial project started when I was in PhD school, and I went to the library one day with the goal of finding all of Ted Berrigan's art writings in art news, because he had said in an interview that I did this. And I'd never heard anyone else say that Ted Berrigan had done this except himself. And so went to the library, and they had all the issues of art news bound in these incredible volumes. And I spent all afternoon by myself, just pulling off these huge books and going through art news and scanning for these TB initials, and very quickly just amassed a lot of writing, and recognizing there was just this huge, this work that had been done that had been unaccounted for, and started to type up some of that material, and was corresponding with Alice and then with Anselm and Eddie about it. And we all recognized that there had been a kind of inertia, and that it was time to begin this project. And like Alice is saying, the intelligence and the attention and the presence that come out of Ted Berrigan's prose is something that helps me re-see what's important in art and in life. And also, as Alice's remarks suggest, everywhere in the book, it's a community of presence. It's one person participating and bringing in a lot of other people, whether that's through reviews or these kind of like social commentary pieces, or just through celebrating friendship, which is so much at the core of the book in so many ways. And also the kind of discernment that's present across Ted Berrigan's prose, the way that he shows you how to see generously and sharply and humorously all the time. It's the process of bringing it together has been a kind of collage, to be honest. I think we've all felt various ways about it, how it's felt to edit it. And also, as Alice was suggesting, you know, like you have a text like Brain Damage and you have a relationship to it, but then I think all of us in different ways have been able to see how these pieces start to like glow or illuminate once they are put in proximity to each other, and they take shape in the book. And I really feel that way about some of the reviews and culture from the 60s, and also about the journals, which like Jordan Davis suggested in his review in the Poetry Foundation, reading the journals that Berrigan prepared for publication makes him want to see all the rest of them. And I think that that's a project worth pursuing at some point as well. But I'm excited to hear what Eddie and Anselm say, and I think there'll be a lot more to talk about, of course.
Thank you. That's great. I think we're going to try to move swiftly through the four of you editors telling us about the book, and then we can field some questions. So I'm going to just hold my own tongue right now from asking you some questions about what you just said, Nick.
I want to see you do that.
It's not happening. Anselm, would you, or Eddie, actually, would you mind sharing your experience with this project? And
yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Yasmin. I prepared some notes about an hour ago, and these are mostly from the point of view of dealing with the editorial process. I kind of served as the liaison between the four of us and Garrett Caples from City Lights, and so that also involves dealing with permissions and dealing with design and formatting decisions. So let me just read these notes. Notes on Get the Money. This is a unique collection. Dad is restless inside the prose form and pushes it in as many directions as he can. A lot of the prose looks and/or operates suspiciously like poetry. The book has a lot of biographical qualities and is almost a literary biography. Though his writing life seems to have essentially begun in Tulsa, his arrival in New York marked the true takeoff of that. And this book tracks a lot of his geographical shifts and also charts the changes of his community right up to the end of his life. And just to add to that, there are just names everywhere in every piece from the beginning to the end, from the 60s journals to something called the Arrival Report that I'll sort of avoid saying too much about, and to the 70s journals in New York, and then to all of the pieces about his true contemporaries. So there's that. Let's see. In another sense, the book also tracks his use of how certain phrases and lines in his poems evolved. There are hints of information in the 60s journals that become lines and characters that are in the sonnets. There's also a sense of how he recycled phrases from the title Get the Money, which appears in multiple pieces in the book, to the work called Life of Turner, which also receives a condensed mention in his mid-70s classic poem, Things to Do in Providence. As Mom and Nick mentioned, the use of his altered translations of Basho as a journal highlight his alchemical approach to form, as do his book reviews of Tom Clark, Ron Patchett, and Lewis McAdams, which are written as free-form poems using and altering lines from the books of each poet to completely inhabit their use of language and also to rib them a little bit while doing so from inside that very language. But they were all old friends. In terms of sort of editorial Bermuda triangles, the piece Words for Joanne Kiger intentionally includes a passage from a separate piece, Teaching with the School Teachers. And twice in the editing of this book, which occurred over roughly 8 years, I found myself thinking that we had made a horrible mistake by accidentally putting part of Teaching with School Teachers into the Joanne Kiger piece. And both times I had to sort of be talked down and corrected. Dad's technique included so much cut up and found language that anything literally lying around on the desk might be on the table for possible inclusion in a work. Dad also had a tendency to quote whole poems in his reviews, but he could keep you guessing inside of that. In his review of lunch poems, he includes poem read at Joan Mitchell's, the whole poem, which is in the book, I think is 2.5 pages. However, that poem was not actually published in Lunch Poems. It had only been published in a magazine called Audit and was otherwise unavailable. Another instance is that in his review of Simon Schuckett's book, Light and Shadow, the review begins with what appears to be an extensive quotation of a poem followed by a short paragraph praising it. When we reached out to Simon Schuckett for permission, he noted that what appears in the review is actually a collage using Simon's lines in an arrangement that is entirely Dad's, and therefore Simon had nothing to do with it and no permission was required. There were actually a few instances like that. Finally, figuring out how to translate all of Dad's typewriter-based formatting decisions into modern computer program-based book design was extremely challenging. Dad's usages were idiosyncratic, representing both styles from a different time and improvisation and rebellion against those styles. Also just artistic decision, which could happen with underlining, well, he didn't really use italics, but lots of underlining and quotations in places you wouldn't expect them to be. It was impossible to remain 100% faithful, and it didn't seem like Dad was actually all that caught up in such exactitude, so a lot of compromise was necessary. But in fact, everything by Dad in the book was written prior to the proliferation of computers, so in a sense, this is truly writing from another era. So those are my notes.
Thanks very much, Eddie. Feels like there's a homework happening on the other side of things with what you guys have been doing. Anselm, would you mind sharing some of your thoughts regarding the book and your own experience in editing it?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everybody for being here, and thank you, Rona and Yasmin, for making this happen. Um, what I'd actually like to do is just read a few brief passages from across the book, because I want to give some kind of sense of the different textures of his prose. And I got very interested at certain points in trying to think about, or just experience, or was experiencing, how he used sentences, and just thinking of the sentence as the unit of composition in these pieces, as opposed to the line, although the line then, as Eddie was pointing out, comes into play in all these other ways. So, and I think because of writing the introduction, this was something that that I was thinking about while I was sort of going through the obligatory self-torture of trying to figure out how to write the introduction at all. So this is just from page 15 from the 60s journals, if anybody's reading along. And this is an example of prose that's being written in journal form with no intention of publication. And much of the writing later understands that it's going to be read by other people. One day last month, I went to the grocery store, bought some bread and Pepsis, and shoplifted a steak, putting it under my belt in the back and letting my shirt tail hang over it. It was for Dick and Carol and Sandy and me for supper. On the way home, a tall, thin wino stopped me and asked me for some money. He was in his late 30s with a sensitive face and was dressed in a gray suit and black shirt, rumpled a little but neat. He was dark, perhaps Spanish. I told him that I was sorry, but I didn't have any money and that I'd had to shoplift food to eat. He was in that state of mild glow winos usually stay in. No kidding, he said. He offered me a handful of change. I told him I didn't need it now that I'd stolen some food. He asked me if I wanted some wine, and I said sure. So he took a pint bottle out of his back pocket, half full, and gravely and politely bade me to drink first. I did, and then passed him the bottle. He took a drink, then handed it back. Have another, he said. No, Jesus was a beggar too. We finished the bottle, and I told him I had to go. He said his name was Maurice, and I told him my name was Ted. He said he'd see me later. As I walked off down the street, he called after me, "Don't forget to love me." And this is a paragraph from a review of Art and Literature, an international review, published in 1964. David Jones, that crashing bore, has the honor of leading off the issue. A few pages further on, we come to the poems of one Diana Witherby, who must be a friend of one of the editors, rich or a swell kid. Later, Donald Barthelme's piece presents a fine opportunity to skip a few pages. Finally, Richard Field, who had a nice, interesting piece in Locus Solus #5, offers a disappointing few pages. Adrian Stokes closes the issue on the note upon which it opened. From Nova Express by William Burroughs. It is 1,000 years since anyone had intercourse with a delicacy, the least attempt thought of holding or possessing such a delicacy, and it is back to the branches, kid. But what about in the house? The house is a photo. But what about the house itself? Lost their enemy, permutate a different pressure. Slow the house merged, created in silent concentration of the workers from the land of silence where speech is impossible. That's the opening of that review. Since we're now in the museum, a fast move here back to 53rd, with only a few minutes to spare, we can easily see the fabled op show. Get the money was the Museum of Modern Art's plan here, I guess. And I guess they got it since approval has been registered by such tastemakers as John Cannaday, the Cretan's Tom Hess, Charlotte Willard, unbelievable, and who have you. The most interesting thing for me about this show was Ad Reinhardt's big red canvas, which was so abominably stretched that it was actually lumpy. And I'm going to skip ahead to something from the 70s journals and then read one little passage from the back of the book. May 12th, 9 o'clock. This is page 144. And this is after part of what goes on in these in the 70s journals is that, among other things, is the work that Dad did on Peter Orlovsky's book that City Lights published, Clean Asshole Poems and Other Vegetable Songs, I think it's called. Waiting for Alan, May 12th, 9 o'clock, waiting for Alan to come over and we finish Peter's manuscript selection to send off to City Lights. Alan arrived finally at 12 midnight, and he and I read through Peter's manuscript, made notes, amended titles, and by 3:30 all the poems were kept in, none deleted, and now after a few typing chores and a call to Peter, we'll ship the whole thing off to Larry Ferlinghetti for him to be final arbiter. I'm ecstatic that all my selections, over 60 pages, or more than half the manuscript, were supported and more than approved of by Alan, and at this moment I feel the glow of a job well done and brought to completion. A job possibly no one else could have done so well in the circumstances. Happy to have been able to work with Peter, pleased and informed and moved by the discovery in his poetry and journals, happy at the part Steve and Alice played, and overjoyed Alan and I could top it off. A fine evening, and I even got some more poems for Simon from Alan or Peter via Alan. Shalom and salute. 13 May, 3:45 a.m. And then finally, this is for the piece Harry Fainlight in Memoriam. We liked one another from the first, like they say, and spent long hours and nights in Ratner's comparing maps of the world of poetry, our world, as we had boyishly taken it to be each. Harry was a serious, intent listener with great handsome sweep of brow and piercing nose above long, sensitive lips. I thought he was beautiful. He could blush and his laugh, part full, part giggle, cracking like a croak of a raven in the middle, encouraged one to greater earnestness, which still now do not seem extravagances as they didn't then. I have this sort of sense that the writing, the sentences become somewhat more elaborate in their sweep, but then I also realized that was always there, but portioned out differently at different paces across those years. He really he builds a lot of sentences clause by clause, and it seems to allow him to spin back, to do certain things, to be graceful, and then when talking about somebody like Harry there near the end, to just create this other kind of open space, like he's pretending he's Henry James or something like that for a second.
Well, he discovered the comma.
Right.
And the semicolon. And he used them very intensely for the last 5 years or so of his life, maybe 10 years. It's the secret to the poem, So Going Around Cities.
There were always commas sprinkled around the gutters of St. Mark's Place.
Yes, I saw a lot of them.
Well, again, I'm going to try to hold myself back from asking all the things that I want to know. They're just piling up, though. And maybe ask a really general question to start us off, and welcome any questions in the chat, or any hands. What would you like to do? Hands?
I want to say one thing. I saw Todd Colby's name there, and I want to thank him for all the work he did on Ted's files in the 80s. He's part of this book, so he's
That's
there.
lovely. Well, I mean, I guess if people feel comfortable asking the questions themselves, I'm happy to field that. And if you rather put it in the chat, then I will call on the chat. So we've got one brewing and another, I think, starting. And I just want to ask, before they all kick off, Eddie, Anselm, to you specifically, what this project felt like, this kind of recuperative art, as Alice mentioned in her earlier remarks, like art, and as Nick suggested as well, this archival project, what it felt like to you as writers, and also, as kind of offspring. I mean, if it felt like you were sort of participating in the curation of your father's kind of prose memory, if that makes sense. or, you know, if there's, I mean, and some, you mentioning at the end that you sort of learning or thinking about his pacing and that kind of thing. I guess I'm asking for more comments like that.
Eddie, should I go first or do you want to go first?
Yeah, you should go first. You're older. Way older, brother.
Let's yeah, well, I want to sort of answer that in a lateral way by just saying that when we presented the manuscript to Garrett Caples, who then brought it to City Lights, it was a selected prose.
Mhm.
And we thought, I don't know, I kind of thought it was 50-50 maybe, the chances that they would take the book. It was just hard to know, you know, because it's such a, you know, it's such a range of idiosyncratic pieces that it was just unclear if others would be able to see it as this whole that we could see it as, you know, and especially in relation to the trajectory of his life and his work. And then this funny thing happened where the book was accepted and Garrett knew what he had and we all went to work on it. And we were also working a lot on the kind of manuscript nuts and bolts, the proofing nuts and bolts across the pandemic. So it gave us this other thing to do and be in touch on. And then at a certain point, Garrett seemed to come back and say, he didn't say it this way, but he seemed to say, oh, I think that the press has actually figured out what they have and they're really psyched and they're going to make it be a big deal in the fall when it comes out. And they want it to be a collected prose, not a selected. And we were like, well, wait a minute, it's a selected prose. We're not including Clear the Range, and which is a whole novel, and we're not including the life of Looking for Chris, of which there's a missing section. So we feel like it needs to be complete. But then we realized that collected was not a complete, and that it would be funny to have it suddenly go from a selected to a collected, and that Dad would probably think that that was amusing in some way. So we ran with it, and I think the principle of going from a selected to collected is get the money. And and I think there's this incredible kind of sense of permission that he takes across the prose. And you can see it one way in the poems, but it comes across in this whole other way in the prose because the writings are very situational. So something like Brain Damage is written, you know, personally, privately, not necessarily intended for any particular function. But then the sentences from the art reviews are sentences lifted from very short art reviews that were written in a house style for Art News in 1965, I think across 65 and 66. And as I mentioned in the intro, it's concurrent with his writing of Tambourine Life. And it could be interesting to read Tambourine Life and then read those sentences or vice versa. You know, so there's jobs and play and consciousness kind of all triangulated throughout the writing, if that makes sense, and working on it just made that clearer.
Eddie, did you want to add anything?
You have to.
Of course. Well, for me, from my point of view, it's all very complex. But well, for one thing, you know, we had already, Mom and Anselm and I had already done a collected poems and a selected poems. So in that sense, working with Dad's, you know, working on such a large collection was not a new thing. But with those books, a lot of it was just, you know, especially with the collected, a lot of stuff was already out there. So it was really just about organizing it and adding some other things and giving it a shape, and even more so with the selected. But this book was really, a different kind of beast. And, I mean, to my mind, it's about 8 years worth of development. So there are a lot of changes in that, from mom bringing us these Xeroxes of the original folders, which I think happened in like 2016 or 2017.
I don't know. I can't remember anything.
Yeah, I mean, some of it, I mean, I have my own personal markers for when things started
Yes.
happening, not all of which I wish to share.
I think it started even before that.
Yeah, and then we got, once Garrett was interested, well, then there was this period where we were typing things up and we were just trying to sort of get everything on page. That took a long time, and we didn't have a publisher. So that's like its own kind of feeling, that this needs to happen, but how will it happen? What shape will it take? Will we be able to do all of this? And then there's a point where Garrett gets interested and COVID starts happening. And then it's like, oh my God, we're all trapped in our houses and the only things we can do are type up Dad's journals and not go crazy. So that lasted for a few years. and within that, we got closer and closer. And then, and emotionally, I think I've felt every possible thing that I could about this book, from joy and love to sort of fear and sorrow and confusion, and all of those things mixed together, which is just sort of life. But yeah, trying to figure out how to grapple with all of this is still a struggle. And and then you get to the magical moment where the book goes out into the world and suddenly it becomes everyone's responses, and what, aside from these events, like, our job is basically done now. And now it becomes a conversation with everybody who reads it and reacts to it. So yeah, that's its own kind of challenge too. And just the only other thing I'd add is that, my whole writing life has been partially a conversation with Dad's work and sort of trying to develop an understanding about how I exist in relation to him. So to sort of dive back all again is amazing. Sometimes it's a little much. Sometimes there's an account of my birth in the middle of the damn thing, and I don't even know how to think about that exactly, but we put it in because Nick provided it, and it seemed to work as a piece, but I have no perspective on it.
It's good.
Yeah, and then in terms of actual writing, like, I don't think there was a period where I went to Mexico for a week when things started opening up again, just to sort of try to clear my head. And I ended up writing a couple pieces, one which was called Things to Do on the Lower East Side in the late 70s and 80s. That's not so much about Dad, but is about being alive in that time period. And then there was another one that was like Tulum Journal or something like that. But that one was a failure and no one will ever see it.
You think no one will ever see it on it. Agnieszka, I think you had a question.
Hi, hello. Oh, thank you all. So I was listening to everything that was said, and there's just so many interesting things, and I can only pick up on a few things. And this idea of the presence, and I think the presence of Ted and the presence on Ted on everybody's lives. And I think you started off, Alice, by saying, the presence is a secret to everything, and it feels like that there appears to be like the presence of friendship and community and love. And I just wonder, I mean, it's a very basic observational point, really. It's not much of a question, and actually sort of echoes what you've just said, Edmund, that that idea, when you read his work, Alice, do you feel, or when you hear him, like when you hear Edmund or Anselm read the work, do you hear Ted? Do you feel him? Yeah,
It's all alive. My point was that's what the secret of great poetry is, that it's just all alive. The presence is there. And I'm getting it again as I look at the book. I haven't seen this material transformed into a book before. And that magic thing has happened where by its becoming a book, it's actually become him again by being a book. But I by writing that, I was led to say the thing about presence.
Yeah.
I think that was something everyone was talking about in literary criticism in the 90s, and they were trying to abolish presence as something to talk about because they didn't know how to have it. Well, fuck them, too bad.
Yeah. Yeah, and what you said, Edmund, with regards to that, I love that, that you're having this by rereading the work and your own position as a writer, is this kind of ongoing conversation you have with your father, but also the writer as well. And I wonder whether you both feel that, actually, whether you feel that as well, Alice, and whether you feel that. Well, you clearly do feel that, but that whether it's his influence or his presence, is that there is this ongoing conversation with Ted in your writing. Do you feel that, Alice, or and
not always, except I notice things about my writing that developed while I was living with him. I lived with him for 13 years, and every once in a while I do something. It depends on whether I'm working on one of his books or not. I let it come back in. I like it, but I do a different kind of thing. I don't name people so much now because I live in a more solitary way in a country that speaks a different language, and so everything is different for me. But something about his architecture and the way that the sentences are made in the poems and in the prose is something I'm familiar with on a daily basis. And probably Anselm and Edmund both are too, and maybe Nick in a Nick way that I don't understand yet. He's smiling at me.
I have a Nick question, but before that, Rona, you've just put out this beautiful quote. Would you like to elaborate?
It's something that this piece, this review of Joe Sarabelo's Millennium Dust is one of my favorite pieces in the whole enormous book, and it just struck me as Eddie was speaking, that there's something really quite kind of personal but also accessible about this text, that it contains a huge amount, and as Anselm's set of readings seem to suggest, it's really different, and the shift in register and kind of construction across the body of work are just extraordinary. But it's there are little moments in it, and this quotation that I put in the chat was one of them, where Ted seems to be kind of talking about other writers who are also friends, but also saying things that can kind of be turned back onto his own writing. He says somewhere else, I can't remember if it's this piece or if it's something else, he says, talks about being pleased and informed and moved. Possibly that was in one of the pieces Anselm read, but again, that was something that I felt reading this book, that you're pleased and informed and moved, and all of that matters an awful lot. It seems to me to be a really joyful text as a whole, and I think thinking about what Alice was saying about presence, I feel kind of similarly about joy in academic kind of receptions of poetry and prose like this, is that it's quite hard to talk about joy, but this seems to be a really kind of joyful text, and that for me really matters. So that's kind of where I was going with that non-question.
Well, thank you. That was nice.
Very. Nick, a question for you about the editorial process, and this is like a form of gossip as well. But I remember when I got to visit Emory in 2000, 9 or 10, so maybe we were overlapping at that point. I was there to look at something else, and someone came and said, I heard you like Ted Berrigan. This book just came in, and this box just came in, and it was just like full of composition books. I think, Alice, I sent you a picture of one. It was done for your birthday or his birthday from you.
Yes, yeah, I had sent those.
Yeah, so it was from you? That box was from
So,
you?
yeah, I think I was.
Okay, that was my mystery that I wanted solved for all these years. So never mind, Nick. Maybe you can give us a sense of what it was like for you. You said, snatching all these, looking for all the TB initials you could find in art news was the beginning. And it seems like that went on for 5 years or so, just like, gathering all the TB initials you could find. So how has this been for you in forming a fuller sense of the artist that you've appreciated through poetry, but now getting, I mean, the mix of prosaic thought, but also kind of diary-like entries and the act of, as Alice called it, talking to lines with other lines?
Yeah, I think the other thing to say too, I came in through the art reviews, and that was totally at the same time that I read Clear the Range for the first time. And so there was this point in 2013, 2014 where I was constantly listening to that great full recording of the sonnets from San Francisco. And I was reading Clear the Range, and I was reading the art reviews, and I was going to the archive for the first time and looking at the journals. And so for me, my experience of Ted Berrigan was all of those things simultaneously. Mm-hmm. And what was astounding was like the way that Clear the Range speaks to the sonnets, and the way that reading the art reviews allows me to reread Tambourine Life, like Anselm is suggesting. And there's this great thing that the poet Tony Toll says in his memoirs of the years 1960 to 63, where Tony Toll says that Ted Berrigan is the foremost scholar on the New York School, and that he had read so much, and that he embodied all of that reading all of the time, and he was that knowledge that he exuded, or that devotion that he exuded, was contagious for those around him. And I felt like I was experiencing a version of that by having all of those different materials outside of any concern about genre, and just being in them simultaneously. Because Ted Berrigan's work has always been such a pleasure, because when you read his poetry, you're reading someone who is clearly a reader. His poems are made up so much of what it means for him to be reading and what he's thinking about as he reads. They're not just about writing. Mm-hmm. And I think that looking at Get the Money shows me a version of Ted Berrigan that maybe a lot of people haven't seen, which is him as someone who's cataloging his attention in sentences here rather than lines, as Anselm was suggesting. And that's partly what I see as the presence. Like, Berrigan is such an editor, and he's such a archival scholar. Like, there's a piece in here about him going to the library at Harvard to make Xerox copies of Frank O'Hara works from the Harvard Advocate. He's also a kind of bibliographer. He's like, as Eddie said, he's putting in circulation a unpublished, outside of book form, Frank O'Hara poem. He wants to put things in circulation. He wants to create access. And I almost see my attention reflected in that attitude. And so it feels sort of unprofessional, my love for that mm-hmm. kind of attention and that kind of care. So the process for me has been one that's really personal, and one that I'm participating in with the family. And that feels like what work and life should be.
Beautiful. I'd like other people to feel free to ask any questions that they might have. And while you're coming up with those, just to circle back, Alice, you said Ted was deliberate. This was like one of the first things you said. And now, Nick, you're talking about what a reader he was. And I loved this last, or one of the last lines of your remarks: too many names, too many, didn't you ever know anyone? so I want to try and bring everything together by asking if that, I remember one of the most like kind of riveting things I read about or by Ted when I started scholarship on him was, I think it was from Talking in Tranquility, where he mentions that he set out to be a great poet. So what do you do if you want to be a great poet? You write sonnets, you know, and so that's what set him starting off on the sonnets. And that like that sense of deliberation and that, you know, the sense of like intention, I will be a great poet, therefore this is what I'll do. And also the, you know, the implicit criticism that you respond to, Alice, with too many names is also a form of, is also a form of him becoming, right, you know, like the poets that he loved, who also offered too many names, for example, Frank
It was
O'Hara.
the criticism of Frank O'Hara, who's now an academic god.
Yes.
So when I said deliberate, I was actually having a visual image of what his handwriting looks like, and the way he signed his name. George Schneeman loved it so much. He loved Ted's handwriting. It wasn't like anyone else's, and he loved for Ted to write on their collaborations because of the quality of his handwriting. I mean, he allowed him to do the writing, and Ted always used a black magic marker, and he wrote in these bound art books, and then I did too, and I always have, with no lines. You can't have any lines, or you won't do it right. It's that's what the deliberation is. But the reading part, I thought of two things to say. One was that we spent a lot of our relationship lying on the bed side by side reading, and people commented on this, but it was what we did, and we loved to do that. And we would be reading different books, obviously, but talking about them. And I forget what the other thing was, but it'll come to me in one second.
Is it about the names?
I wanted to say, no, it wasn't about, I know it was something Doug said. Doug said that Ted's poems were like the construction, they were like cognitions. He gave that name to them. They're like the construction of, or representation of pieces of consciousness. And they always are, no matter what period of his writing we're talking about. They're showing a mind responding to things read, to thoughts, to the outer world, but in this way that there's a back and forth between him and words all the time. And it's in the mind. It's in the mind. It's in the mind and in the world at the same time. And it's a cognition. I think Doug was right. It's a good word.
Because that allows it to also, calling it a cognition also allows it to retain a sort of structure.
Yes, it's a structure. There's a structure.
Can I follow up on that a little bit?
Yes.
Please.
More about the names. I mean, I think the cognition, yeah, that's a really great way to put it. And this balance of what's internal and what's external is always playing out in the poems in a certain way, and then in a lot of the writing, that's the prose writing that's happening too. But in the reviews, for instance, the attention is being put more explicitly onto others. And but I also think in the later pieces, he does something where he's sort of, by writing about somebody in a way that might be a blurb, he's actually assessing their character as part of assessing their work. Not in a heavy judgmental way, but in terms of releasing some extra internal information about how he views the person as a way of also talking about the work, because he doesn't want to isolate the work completely from the person. But I also feel like you can, over here, you can say people's names are also words. They're sound structures. They come in, they create different kinds of points of identification and association. But I also think that what he's doing in the writing is populating it. And I think there's a way in which he picks up on that from Frank O'Hara. But he picks up on it in another way, maybe from Allen Ginsberg and Philip Whalen also. So you have other people in your work. There are other people in your lives, other bodies, people you're thinking about. And it's less about, it's often about friendship, but it's less about gossip and naming than it is about letting other people into the work.
It's what Dante did.
It's what Dante did. Well, it's what Coleridge did at times too. And he did it differently than O'Hara and Allen did. And he did it all the way through. And so the work, the part of the presence of his that's active in the work is also the presence of other people in much of it, if that makes sense. You know, they provide balance, counterbalance, and they're focal points for attention and allow certain things to be said.
I was just thinking of something Jeff Ward writes about the naming. He says it's a form of like creating an ongoing elegy. You know, naming someone is kind of both saying hello and goodbye to them in a poem. And your "Don't forget to love me" line reminded me of the one in last poem, "Inspiring strangers sadly died." So you got the notion of like the physical anchor or the population of the poem, but also the kind of like spectral kind of coming and going that gets to happen when you have someone brought in and then the next line happens.
I just want to say also that, I mean, last poem is this like a complete elegiac poem, but it's also a certain kind of form, the last poem.
Right.
And it made me weep a million times in the past. And then at a certain point, I said to Mom, because I'd started reading Samuel Beckett, and there's this line in the middle of it where he says something like, "I once had the honor of meeting Beckett and I dug him." And I said, "Dad met Beckett? How come I don't know about that?" And she said, "No, that's a Robert Creeley line. Robert Creeley said that, and he just stuck it."
That poem never made me cry. It has never, ever made me cry. I was present while he was writing it, and he really had such fun with it.
I read it when I was 15, so I had to cry.
Yeah.
Of course.
Well, it made me cry, and I'm not related, so I can't imagine the struggle not to cry. And so that's Creeley, and also the reification of one's experience, which is in that poem, is Creeley as well, isn't it?
Yes, he's you know, he's taking from the sources. They're kind of all around him, and he felt like writing a poem, and he invented this form, the last poem. He put it at the top, and then he was so amused by the fact that he put our entire address in it. Yeah. And every time he read it aloud, he started laughing at that point because he put the zip code in too. He loved that. I mean, for him, it was funny until the end. And then he actually wrote the last line, I believe. Let none
forget my aunt who called me friend.
Yes, he wrote that, I think. I think he actually wrote that out of he thought he had no imagination. It was one of the things he said all the time. It was really ridiculous that he thought that he thought he had no imagination and that he couldn't describe anything. He had this list of these things that were his defects that had become his strengths.
And yet he was laughing while we're all crying 20 years later. I mean, I'm sure someone else is curious about the title, how you guys settled on Get the Money. I'm guessing
they did it. And there was a certain amount of, some of us couldn't figure out whether we approved of it or not. And then others just really liked it right away. And now it's obviously the title. And the fact that it's a collected prose called Get the Money is just the way it was always meant to be.
I needed some time to sit with it for a while, and then we never came up with any other ideas.
I sat with you about it, but didn't I have another idea at one point? I can't remember. I can't remember the sequence of anything now.
I said we should call it Get the Money.
I know you did, always. I know.
That was you. You win.
Well, Nick was like Batman the detective tracking down every lead, and Mom was the sort of source of all wisdom like Athena, and Eddie was the man in the high castle, but not in an alternate universe, directing all the traffic. And at a certain point, I was like, well, I got to do something. So I wrote the introduction and I said, hey, we should call it Get the Money. Because I just thought if a book is called Get the Money, then somebody who has no idea what it is might pick it up just because it says that.
How to get the money.
Yeah, I thought it was
looks good on
good.
it looks good on the title page, on the cover. It looks wonderful on the cover, actually.
I think you're all referencing like not remember. Sorry, Rona, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I was going to ask if any of you had a copy of it with you that you could hold up and show us, because I've seen it, but this is PDF. Okay, good. And will you turn it sideways so we can see how thick it is as well? Yeah. Okay. It looks great. I'm really looking forward to getting a physical copy. Thanks. Yes, Lynn, sorry.
No, I mean, you're all kind of referencing like not remembering time, time feeling warped, and the pandemic happening sort of in the middle of this project, like wanting to do it, then pandemic, then emerging and having done it. So I think, Eddie, you said like there was nothing to do but just transcribe all of this old material. And I want to offer that you might be more generous with yourselves about not understanding time, because we all still don't understand what to do with that time. But also to say how amazing it is that this is what came of that black hole. And I guess I'm wondering if putting it out there is like signifying the end of that kind of like isolation, yet you had each other in it.
Well, who knows what's going to happen?
I know. I
in the
don't
coming
dare say that
days
out loud,
and
actually.
weeks. But I did not take the teaching route. So I've had a 9-to-5 job, for the last 20 years, and suddenly working from home was like a dream come true. Like, I like my coworkers and I like seeing them, but being in the land of cubicles and bright neon lights has always been pretty horrifying. But to actually be able to be at home all the time meant that I could do my job, and then I could turn to my other computer and work on Get the Money for a little while, and that I could arrange to have phone calls with Garrett during business hours when I was supposed to be working. So it actually, in that sense, it was really helpful, because suddenly I had much more control over my time. I didn't, if I'd still been in an office, I don't think I could have been as productive, because I'd be like self-conscious, feeling like I had to hide what I was doing, or just trying not to get people to ask me about it. Because my corporate life and my poetry life, I mean, they bleed together a little bit, but for the most part, I don't, it's too complex to be fielding questions about it while I'm trying to get the money,
Right. I think is it Leanne Brown? Is that what that email address is? Is asking, is it because prose is more money getting than poetry?
Supposedly.
Well, he wasn't getting paid to write.
us,
poems.
yeah,
He
it
was
doesn't
getting paid
matter.
to write art reviews. Wasn't it? I think the art reviews were like $15 a review. Isn't that what you said somewhere, Mom?
Yeah, I think so. I think they were $15. I think that's what he told me. They were really like nothing. But I could see him learning so much about writing, about describing things and writing about art, and learning how to be compressed about it and so forth. I really like the short art reviews, but he didn't like his art reviews that much. He was very diffident about them. He didn't think they were as good as John Ashbery's, but he didn't think Frank's were as good as John's either.
That's a good question.
Yes, please, Greg.
Yeah, this is, I guess, for Nick, and maybe Todd could weigh into the section of the sentences from the short reviews. Those are, each of those little sentences or little bits are excerpted from the short reviews. So there's a lot more art writing that's not in this book.
There are
right?
more sentences. Anselm did that.
Yeah, Anselm did that.
Okay. So So I'm curious, I'd like to see all the art writing, because I like the art writing a lot. This
I
is
think
Ted being clear in a different way for a broader audience, perhaps, trying to be more sane, or,
It was what they
tethered.
wanted him to do at Art News.
Yeah, of course, of
He
course.
was writing for the magazine, I think.
Yeah, no, it would have been rejected.
He
if it
was
were-
learning. You can see
Yeah.
him learning. I can see him learning anyway.
one of the things that came up was that we initially had the short reviews in their entirety as part of the manuscript. And I mean, and that's another reason why it was kind of funny when the book went from a selected to a collected, is that was the one section when we presented it as a manuscript. It was that was the one thing that could kind of most easily be pared down or cut. I mean, and the idea was that it was maybe going to be cut entirely because it took up, I don't know, 30, 35 pages or something manuscript wise. So he was writing 5 or 6 per issue across the year. And it would make an interesting other publication, like a chapbook or a pamphlet or something like that, because there were a couple things that happened. I just thought there were all these really great sentences in there, and many of which belie the fact that he believed he couldn't describe. And then there was humor in there, but then they're much more obviously written in a kind of Art News house style when you read them in full. And there are also all these names, and we sort of agreed to take the names out. It would be interesting to see them with the names, because actually I would say 90-95% of those names would not be recognizable to most people.
No,
Like
no, most of the reviews are of people who have disappeared from the art world.
So it's this picture of the art world in New York City that is not, might be a little eye-opening in a certain way. But the impetus to make the list of sentences actually, I think, came from the Rackstraw Downs edited book of Fairfield Porter's art writings, Art in Its Own Terms.
Right.
They publish some of Fairfield Porter's short reviews. And then there's a list of sentences that goes about 4 pages that's also called From the Short Reviews. So I remembered that because I quite liked that book, and that was the model for putting together that list.
I have 2 additional comments. One is that at the end of the reviews section, we include 2 of the full
Right.
short length reviews, one of Red Grooms and one of Joe Brainerd. So that's sort of what the longest version of that form is like. The other thing is, yeah, it's pretty hilarious that when they asked us to go from a selected to a collected, the page count didn't change. They didn't give us any more pages or anything. They just, it just kind of, it was more decoration. But it's true enough, but I think essentially they just wanted, once they decided to make it their sort of lead book of the fall, they're like, yeah, let's beef it up to a collected. It just sounds better. And they asked us to include the date range too, so that it had to sort of, just sort of better packaging, I guess.
Is the implication with the date range that there might be an earlier collected out there somewhere? Like of earlier writing?
I think, honestly, I think they just thought it sounded more authoritative. I don't think that they put anything else behind it. But if there's any prose he wrote in like Tulsa in 1959, I'd be interested to see it.
He wrote a poem. He wrote some poems then.
Yeah.
But I don't remember any prose. He probably wrote some of the papers, the George Bernard Shaw stuff. That's around.
Right. Actually, yeah, Ron has a copy of his thesis.
I
Mom,
do too.
what's the story about Dad's first poem that he wrote when he was a kid that was
He wrote a
published?
poem when his grandfather died, and it was published in a newspaper, but I've never seen it. Something just happened to the screen, and now it says Ian's iPhone.
Ah.
I have also heard the story of that poem in the paper, but I've never seen it. So
I don't think he kept a copy, or he would have
Nick?
shown it to.
Yeah, I just the other day, I've been very slowly typing like this huge Word document of hundreds of uncollected Ted Berrigan poems that I've been finding, and there are hundreds of them. And I just looked back at that anecdote where he tells that story, and I was like, how am I going to find this newspaper from Providence?
well, maybe Ron. I think I've heard the story from Ron.
Mhm.
There's also this sentence in the April 11th entry from the 60s journals. In the 9th grade, I wrote many morbid horror poems with titles like "There's a Body in the Casket."
I think. I'm wondering if anyone might have any questions before we start to honor the time frame that we set out with.
There have been remarks passing and
There have been
questions being
remarks.
asked, but they come and go too fast.
Well, Simon Pitet asks about parallels with Jimmy Schuyler's art writings with the short and the long art writings, and Vincent Katz is very much looking forward to reading the collection.
There were some others before, like about 20 minutes ago. People have been saying this and that.
I think we've managed to capture most of them, although Matt Travers offers a title for the complete journals of Ted Berrigan, which is "Don't Forget to Love Me." So that's out there now. Would anybody?
Oh, sorry, Yasmin.
Sorry, go ahead, Nick.
The other potential book that could follow, I mean, we have Clear the Range. We have the 4 sections of Looking for Chris, which is a really incredible text. It's like the sonnet, the sonnets, but a novel. Is the potential of a selected or a collected letters of Ted Berrigan. And sometimes when I think about that book not existing, I'm like astounded over and over again, because my familiarity with the letters is always in my reading of his other works. And so that's kind of another like prose.
There are also the collaborations.
Mm-hmm.
There could be a book of collaborations, but I don't have a large mass of those. Those things are just in the air somewhere. Probably people everywhere have them, and if they sent them into a central person like you or me or Anselm or Edmund, we could start on some project like one of those projects. This is a solicitation for.
I was going to say, I'm liking that a new project is being born.
What we're really looking for is part 3 of Looking for Chris. If anyone out there has part 3 of Looking for Chris, please let us know.
Okay, we'll do a wider call
Okay.
and a social media campaign for that.
Okay.
And Greg asks, as far as letters, do you have each side of the correspondence? So do you have the responses as well?
No, not always. I mean, that's like impossible to do, right? I mean, you both know that.
Yeah.
It's so hard to stitch together the fullness of it, but Ted is a really good letter writer. He's a really good correspondent. So it'll be just as funny and full of love and sharpness as Get the Money.
Can I ask the one kind of hard question before we wrap up? Do you think you would have liked this? You know, the editorial, the decision making that you all must have had to do in deciding what to keep in and what to keep out. Do you think that having this out there is part of his, as you mentioned, he was constantly publishing and republishing and trying to create platforms for poetry's dissemination, or this kind of poetry's dissemination. So do you think this would have, having this collection out there is kind of a form of perpetuating his project?
I'm sure he expected it. It's completely logical.
I think he would have enjoyed reading it, not having known about it. If it suddenly he appeared and then we handed him the book, I think he would be completely amused and would have fun reading it.
He would say a lot. He would have a lot to say about it.
I think he would like that we republished the John Cage interview without the disclaimer. And then there were these decisions that we had to make at times. But also in reading the 70s journal, I mean, in the passage I read, when he was working on Peter's book, he was actually taking journal entries from Peter's journals and turning them into poems that could then be in the book. So, this sort of converting something from one form to another and then making a decision about placing it in the shape of a book. I don't know. I imagine, I never talked to him about this kind of thing, but I imagine we always talked about baseball, but I imagine he would understand the translation process or the transformation process. The disclaimer on the Cage essay, sorry, let me just,
Sorry.
when the John Cage essay was, the John Cage interview, when it was published as an interview with John Cage, but he completely made it up, right? And then it won an award. And that's a whole other story, because the people who gave it the award didn't know that it wasn't completely made up. So they had to figure out what to do about the fact that they were going to give him this money. And he said, well, John Cage shouldn't get any of it. And then they were like, well, wait, he did all the work. And they're like, no, he didn't do any of the work. And then Dad realized that they didn't realize that the interview was made up. But it's been on the sort of Poetics List website for a long time, but it has the disclaimer at the bottom that it's made up entirely by Ted Berrigan. And it seemed important to me that not be put in this book so that people could be fooled again.
Right, so that they could continue to read it as he first intended it and have that experience.
Yeah, and this book also adds another made-up interview with John Ashbery, which the Cage interview is famous and it gets talked about a lot when Berrigan's work is brought up. But now we see there's another one, and this is a whole form that he's
Well,
repeating.
it's done. It was done differently. That is simply an interview with the star of Flipper, with his name changed, and no words are changed. But Ted was really interested in the fact that the star of Flipper's favorite song was "She's Not There," and he thought that, and he liked that part really a lot. So he
When you
just
say
took
the star of Flipper, do you mean the dolphin?
out of the TV guide. I was going to say about Peter's book was that Ted told me that everything that he found in the journals that he thought he found, Peter actually knew about and knew was a work, but needed him to say it. If you follow.
Right.
You're all looking at me blankly.
No, we're following, and we're following.
Peter had great poetry intelligence, but he needed to be told. He needed to be told at each point that he had that, and that the poems were really good.
Mm.
And it's smiling vegetable songs, clean asshole poems, and smiling vegetable songs.
I can think of no finer last line for this evening. I think we had promised that we would keep this at an hour, and we've gone over by 20 minutes, so we might close it off. But as always, I wish I could talk to you all forever. And I want to thank you very much on behalf of Rona and I and our little network for New York School Studies. For your generosity in sharing your project with us today, and also for doing your project, because you're going to be seeing a lot more criticism to come from it. So we're all really grateful. So thank you for being here, and maybe we can give a pretend or a real round of applause.
Thanks, Yasmin. Thanks, Rena.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Yes.
everyone. Have a lovely evening or afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.